So now let's turn back to skepticism. And what we're going to do first is we're going to show two things. First of all, we're going to show that on Lewis's theory, in most ordinary contexts, the sentence, "I know I have hands," is true. Just to say what I mean by ordinary contexts, I take ordinary contexts to be basically ones outside the philosophy classroom. Contexts where we're just thinking about mundane questions and not questions about whether we're brains and vats, or dreaming, or being deceived by an evil demon. Cases where we're not taking things like that seriously. So we're going to see that on Lewis's contextualist theory of knowledge, the claim, "I know I have hands," is true in contexts like that. The second thing we're going to show is that in most skeptical contexts, that is, contexts where we are taking seriously skeptical scenarios, the sentence, "I know I'm not a brain in a vat," is false. So when we are in the epistemology classroom and thinking about brains and vats, claims of knowledge of heavyweight propositions are false. So let's take the first thing first. Why is it true in ordinary contexts that the claim, "I know I have hands," is true? Well, we can see this by just going through Lewis's rules and seeing what they predict. So first of all, let's start with the rule of reliability. Remember what that said? That said that unless the other rules say otherwise, worlds where your perception is screwy for some reason are not relevant. So by default, unless there's some overriding factor, skeptical scenarios are not going to get to be relevant. So then we got to check the rest of the rules and see, well, what do they say? Is it the case that any of the other rules say that skeptical scenarios should be relevant in ordinary contexts? And it looks like the answer is no. So just start with the rule of actuality. So remember, that says that the actual world is always relevant. Well, we can take it for granted that the actual world is one and where we're not brains and vats. So even though the actual world is going to be relevant, it's not a skeptical scenario. So skeptical scenarios are not going to get in that way. What about the rule of resemblance? Well, remember, the rule of resemblance says that if something is already relevant and a different possibility resembles it, then the second possibility must also be relevant. But skeptical scenarios are not going to get in this way either, because skeptical scenarios are not very much like the ordinary world. They don't resemble it really at all. So it's not going to be through the rule of resemblance either that skeptical scenarios get in there. The last rule we got to think about is the rule of attention. So remember, the rule of attention says that whenever you're attending to a possibility, whenever you're paying attention to some possible world, then it is automatically relevant. But in ordinary scenarios, as we said, it's just sort of by definition of what an ordinary context is, we're not paying attention to skeptical scenarios. Those are kind of special things that we pay attention to in the philosophy room, not in the ordinary life room. So as a matter of fact, skeptical scenarios are not going to get in through the rule of attention because we're not attending to those things in most ordinary scenarios. So we started off saying that according to the rule of reliability, unless the other rules say otherwise, skeptical scenarios are not going to be relevant. And indeed, we looked at the other rules and they didn't say otherwise. They didn't say that skeptical scenarios should be relevant. So what this means is that when we are making claims like "I know I have hands," the relevant worlds don't include skeptical scenarios. And remember, once they're not in there, then we can rule out, on the basis of the evidence that we currently have, the relevant possibilities where we don't have hands. Because it's only the skeptical scenarios, the scenarios where we would have exactly the same evidence, but the relevant propositions are false, that those are the only ones that we couldn't rule out on the basis of our evidence. Let's now think about why is it true that in most skeptical contexts, "I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat" is true. Well, the reason is actually quite simple, and it all comes down to the rule of attention. So remember I said the rule of attention is going to be really important, and here is really where it starts doing the work. Because when you start thinking about the sentence, "I know I'm not a brain in a vat," it looks like you're immediately going to start paying attention to brain in a vat scenarios. You couldn't possibly not start thinking about brain in a vat scenarios whenever somebody said, "I know I'm not in a brain in a vat." That's just inevitable. That's just the way that we work. We start paying attention to those scenarios whenever people say sentences like those. So by the rule of attention, usually when you say, "I know I'm not a brain in a vat," that is immediately going to make relevant worlds where you are a brain in a vat. And of course, you can't rule those worlds out given your evidence. So what's going to happen is, whenever you're considering these sentences in skeptical contexts, because you're attending to those possibilities, they're going to be relevant, But then that means there are going to be relevant possibilities where you are a brain in a vat that you can't rule out. Because again, skeptical scenarios are ones that are consistent with all our evidence, so we can't rule them out. The only way we could possibly know claims like you're not a brain in a vat is if the brain in a vat worlds weren't relevant in the first place. But the whole point is that once you start thinking about those sentences, that makes those scenarios relevant. So something that's really important on Lewis's view is that once you start thinking about claims like, I know I'm not a brain in a vat, that will immediately tend to push you into a context where it's false. Because once you start thinking about those claims, they basically force you to start paying attention to brain in a vat scenarios. And once you start doing that, that is, once you get into a skeptical context, then you're inevitably going to be in one where those claims are false. So what we've seen so far is that this claim, the claim that you know you have hands, is true in most ordinary contexts, and that this claim, the claim that you know you're not brain in a vat, that is false in most skeptical contexts. But this isn't yet to say exactly what the response to the skeptical argument is. How does this actually help with skepticism? So to see this, it's going to be helpful to go back to the board and fill out the situation a little bit. So here's what we have figured out so far. So let's say OC, this means ordinary context. We've seen that this claim H is true. And in skeptical contexts, we've seen that the claim in B is false. So far, we know the truth value of one of these two claims in each context. So now let's think about the other claim in each context. So first of all, let's do the slightly easier case of the skeptical context, and let's ask, what is the truth value of the claim in H? Is it true in a skeptical context on Lewis's view that to say of you that you know that you have hands in a skeptical context? And the answer, which is kind of obvious, is that it's not true to say that of you. Why is that? Well, remember, we saw that this is false. And the reason it's false is because in a skeptical context, skeptical scenarios are relevant. For instance, brain in a vat worlds are relevant here because we're considering the proposition that you're not a brain in a vat. That immediately makes you attend to worlds where you are a brain in a vat. So we've seen there are worlds that are relevant where you're a brain in a vat. But remember, those are not worlds where you have hands. Those are worlds where you merely think you have hands, but you're actually this disembodied brain in a vat. But then when you plug that through in Lewis's theory, if there's a world where you're a brain in a vat, that means there's a relevant world where you don't have hands. And just by definition of skeptical scenarios, your evidence is not going to rule that out. So that means there's going to be some world that is not ruled out by your evidence and that is relevant where you don't have hands. So for that reason, this claim is going to count as false in a skeptical context. And that's not terribly surprising. Let's now consider what is true of the claim B in the ordinary context. And this is where things maybe get a little bit more surprising. So let's think, is it true in ordinary contexts that you know you're not a brain in a vat on Lewis's theory? And the answer, maybe surprisingly, is yes, this claim is in fact true. It is in fact true of you in most ordinary contexts that you know you're not a brain in a vat. That sentence is true. Why is that? Well, we got to ask ourselves, in ordinary contexts, are there any brain in a vat worlds that are relevant? And given what we already said about the claim H, that it's true, it looks like actually in ordinary contexts there are just no brain in a vat worlds which are relevant. Because in ordinary contexts we're not attending to worlds like that, we're not paying attention to them. And we saw, given the other rules, they're just not going to be irrelevant. This is what we established when we talked about H. But of course, if there are no worlds where you're a brain in a vat that are relevant in the first place, then the knowledge claim is just going to be trivially true. Of course, it's going to be the case that you've ruled out all of the worlds where you are a brain in a vat that are relevant if there just are none that are relevant in the first place. So the answer is that this claim is actually trivially true in the first place. So now we can see a little better why this is actually helping us respond to skepticism. Remember, the first premise of the skeptical argument is that you don't know that you're a brain in a vat. And we use that with closure to argue for the claim that you don't know that you have hands. What Lewis says is that in ordinary contexts, you both know the claim that you have hands and the claim that you're not a brain in a vat. You know both of these things in most ordinary contexts. So in ordinary contexts, the first premise of the skeptical argument is just false. That's why the argument doesn't get off the ground for Lewis. That's why it's true to say of you in ordinary contexts that you know you have hands. Now remember, we wanted to explain two things. One thing we wanted to explain was, why does the argument from dreaming seem so persuasive in the first place? Why would we go along with the first premise that you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat if that's just not true most of the time? And Lewis's contextualism gives us an answer. And the answer is basically that, well, even though this claim is true, it's very hard to stay in an ordinary context once you start considering it. Because in ordinary context, basically the reason why the claim is true is because we're not thinking about it. Because so long as you're not thinking about the claim, in ordinary contexts, brain in a vat worlds are not going to be relevant. The moment you start thinking about the claim that you're a brain in a vat, that's going to move you from an ordinary context into a skeptical context. Because by the rule of attention, thinking about brain in a vat worlds is going to make them relevant, and so that's going to make you be in a skeptical context. But of course, once you're in a skeptical context, those claims are now going to be false. You're now going to be in a context where this sentence says something false and not something true. So the explanation for why the dreaming argument seems so good is that even though this claim is true in ordinary contexts, even though it's true to say of you in ordinary contexts that you know that you're not a brain in a vat, once you start thinking about that claim, you immediately move out of the ordinary context and into a skeptical context where the claim is no longer true. So in ordinary contexts, both claims are true, but once you start thinking about this one, this will move you into a skeptical context where both of the claims are false. So we can see that on Lewis's theory, the first premise is the one that we reject. It's worth being clear as well that the theory actually does validate closure, and we can see that really quickly by drawing one of our possible worlds diagrams again. So to see why closure holds on Lewis's view, what we're going to do is we're going to see that there's actually a way of drawing this idea of the knowledge set that we saw in our very first lecture. So even though Lewis's definition of knowledge, or his semantics for knowledge, is more complicated, there's still a way of recovering this idea of the knowledge set. Once we do that, it's going to be then very easy to see why closure holds on Lewis's view. So let's first remind ourselves exactly what the view says. It says that the sentence S knows P is true in a context C, just in case all relevant worlds in C where not P is true are ruled out by S's evidence. So this is the somewhat more complicated view of knowledge that we saw before. So what we're going to first do is we're going to draw the set of worlds that are relevant in C, and we're going to draw the worlds that are ruled out by S's evidence. So let's start with the worlds that are relevant. And I'm just going to draw a circle around here. And I'm going to call it R. So these, we're imagining, are the worlds that are relevant in this context. We can even put R sub C. So these are the worlds that are relevant. Now let's draw in the worlds that are compatible with S's evidence in this scenario. And here I'm going to draw it. I'm going to draw some of them. So some of the worlds that are relevant are going to be compatible with S's evidence. And there are also going to be some worlds that are irrelevant, but that are also compatible with S's evidence. So I'll draw them at the side. And we have some more over here. It's worth remembering that this region of the picture, these worlds at the side that are irrelevant but compatible with S's evidence, these are where the skeptical scenarios live, or at least where they live in ordinary contexts. So let's focus in on this green region in the middle. So these are, well, they're in the green region, so that means they're compatible with S's evidence, but they're also inside the blue region, which means that they're also relevant. In other words, these are the worlds that are both relevant and compatible with the evidence that we have. And in fact, this region is our knowledge set. On Lewis's view, you know something, or the sentence S knows P is true, just in case P is entailed by this set. And what did we say it was for something to be entailed by this set? Well, it's just for it to be a superset. So let's draw in some propositions. So let's imagine that S knows P. So this is a picture where S knows P, because P is a superset of this region in the middle. For concreteness, I'll write K beside it, because this is now our knowledge set. So this is now a situation where S knows P. Let's now further imagine that P entails Q. So again, we know how to draw that. For P to entail Q is just for Q to be a superset of P, or for P to be a subset of Q. So let's draw our final circle, Q. So in this situation, K is a subset of P, and P is a subset of Q, because P entails Q. Now we've got to ask ourselves, is this a situation where you know Q? Because closure, remember what closure says. It says when you know P and P entails Q, then you can know Q. So we know this is a situation where you know P. Is it a situation where you know Q as well? When we look at it, we see, of course, it has to be. Because if K is a subset of P and P is a subset of Q, then K just has to be a subset of Q. Put slightly differently, if Q entails P and P entails Q, then K entails Q. So this is just a picture of a particular scenario, but when you think through the details, you'll see that it's completely general. So in general, in any given situation, we can draw a picture which represents the relevant worlds in the given context, and we can also draw in the worlds that are compatible with the agent's evidence in that situation. This allows us to identify basically their knowledge set. It's the set of worlds that are both relevant and compatible with the evidence. And once we do that, we can start doing our familiar possible world stuff. And in particular, we can see that closure holds. It holds just because whenever P entails Q and Q entails R, P entails R, or put in terms of subsets, when P is a subset of Q and Q is a subset of R, P is a subset of R. That principle and the closure principle come to basically exactly the same thing in this framework. So this is why closure holds. The last thing to do is to say why Lewis's view solves this puzzle that we mentioned at the beginning for relevant alternatives views. So the puzzle was that we wanted a relevant alternatives view that said that you could know that you're not a brain Nevat. And the question was, well, on a relevant alternatives view, that would have to be because brain Nevat worlds were not relevant. But how could that be when the claim you're considering is the claim that you know you're not a brain Nevat? The answer for Lewis is that the worry sets up and has the wrong conception of what the relevant alternatives are. The worry assumes that we find the relevant alternatives by looking at the proposition and looking at the alternatives to the proposition. This is not how things work on Lewis's view, though. What determines what worlds are relevant is not the proposition directly, but rather what context we're in. So to see what the relevant alternatives are, you've got to look at what context you're in. Why does this help here? Well, remember we said that in ordinary contexts, the claim that you know you're not a brain Nevat is true. And it's true precisely because you're not considering it. It's true precisely because you're not attending to brain Nevat worlds, so they are not among the relevant alternatives. Context determines what the relevant alternatives are, and in such contexts, you're not paying attention to brain Nevat worlds. So this actually gives a nice answer to the challenge. How could it be that the claim, I know I'm not a brain Nevat, is true in an ordinary scenario, when it looks like brain Nevat worlds should be relevant for it? Well, it's because the context determines what worlds are relevant, not the proposition. And in ordinary context, you're just not considering that claim, and so you're not considering the worlds that would make it false. So let's take stock and recap what just happened. We started off by showing that on Lewis's theory, in ordinary contexts, it's true to say the claim that you know you have hands. That claim expresses a true proposition in most ordinary contexts. I know I'm not a brain Nevat. In skeptical contexts, we also saw that the claim, I know I'm not a brain Nevat, as said in skeptical contexts, expresses a false proposition. When we filled things out a bit more, we saw that in skeptical contexts, it's also false to say that you know you have hands. And slightly more surprisingly, in ordinary contexts, it's true to say of you that you know you're not a brain in a vat. For this reason, we can see that Lewis is rejecting the very first premise of the argument from ignorance. He's rejecting the premise, or at least in ordinary contexts, he's saying, usually the premise that says you know you're not a brain in a vat, that is usually false, because usually we're in ordinary contexts, and that claim expresses a false proposition in ordinary contexts. However, we get an explanation for why the argument seems good. We get an explanation for why it often seems true to say, and indeed is true to say, on his view, I know I'm not a brain in a vat. The explanation is that once you start thinking about that claim, that immediately moves you into a context where it's false. Because once you start thinking about the claim, now you are starting to consider skeptical scenarios. And once you do that, by the rule of attention, the claim is going to be false. We then saw why closure holds on Lewis's view. We saw that using these two notions of the worlds that are relevant and the worlds that are compatible with your evidence, we can identify the knowledge set. And once you do that, it's very straightforward to see that you have a view where closure holds. So on some, Lewis's view, while it's also a kind of relevant alternatives view, takes a very different approach to rejecting this argument than Nozick's. Nozick responded by rejecting closure, and he said that it is just unequivocally true in all cases that you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat. Lewis says that claim is actually usually false, but it's such that considering it pushes you into a context where it tends to express something true. This explains the first thing that we said we wanted to explain at the beginning, which is that we wanted to say, well, why does the argument seem so convincing? But it also explains the second thing we wanted to explain. So remember, we wanted to say, how could it ever be that brain in a vat worlds were not relevant when you're considering the proposition that you're not a brain in a vat? The answer is that that scenario just never arises. However, the claim that you know you're not a brain in a vat, that claim is true so long as you're not paying attention to it. Once you start paying attention to it, it becomes false.